In 1873, the United States Army officially adopted the Colt single-action Army revolver as its standard sidearm. Newspapers called it the gun that would tame the West. Manufacturers promoted it as the defining weapon of the frontier era. Within a decade, the six-shooter had become so thoroughly associated with the American West that separating the two felt almost impossible. There was just one problem. Most of the people living and working on the frontier at that exact moment did not own one, could not afford one, and were using something else entirely. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. If you are new here, this is where the real history of the frontier gets examined honestly, without the polish that the legend puts on everything. If that is what you are here for, subscribe now. We publish these regularly, and there is a great deal more to uncover. Now, the six-shooter, the revolver, the handgun worn on the hip of every cowboy, every outlaw, every sheriff, every gambler, in every film and painting and paperback novel that the Western genre has ever produced. It is not simply a weapon in the mythology, it is a symbol. It represents a specific kind of power, the power of the individual, the idea that one man, with one weapon, could determine the outcome of any confrontation through the combination of skill and nerve, and the mechanical reliability of 6 rounds in a rotating cylinder. That symbol is so deeply embedded in the cultural image of the frontier that most people have never stopped to ask a basic practical question. Was the revolver actually the weapon most commonly used, carried, and relied upon by the people who lived and worked in the American West between the 1850s and the turn of the century? The answer is no. Not even close, but the real answer is more complicated than a simple contradiction, and getting to it requires understanding something about frontier life that the mythology has almost entirely erased. It requires understanding what weapons were actually for in that environment, who could afford what the physical conditions of frontier work demanded from a tool, and how the economics of the gun trade actually functioned across thousands of miles of difficult terrain. Hold those questions. We are going to work through them carefully, because by the end of this, the image you carry of the armed frontiersman is going to look substantially different from the one you arrived with. Let us begin with the most basic question of all. What were weapons actually used for on the frontier? The mythology has one answer: confrontation between men. The gun, as an instrument of human conflict, carried for the specific purpose of being available when another man needed to be stopped or killed. Everything else is secondary to that purpose in the Western story. The gun is a social instrument. It mediates disputes. It establishes hierarchies. It is the final argument in every conversation that cannot be resolved any other way. That purpose was real. Weapons were used in human conflicts on the frontier. People were shot. People were killed. That is documented and undeniable. But it was not the primary purpose for which most frontier people carried or used firearms. Not even close. The primary purpose was food. Hunting was not a recreational activity on the frontier in the sense that the word recreation implies today. It was subsistence. It was the difference for a significant portion of the frontier population at various points in the settlement period between eating and not eating. A man working a remote mining claim 40 miles from the nearest supply point could not rely on steady deliveries of preserved food to sustain himself through a long winter. What lived in the landscape around him was often a critical part of what kept him alive. Deer, elk, antelope, wild turkey, smaller game. These animals were hunted constantly, systematically, by people across the frontier, not because hunting was pleasant, though some found it so, but because Protein was necessary, and walking to the nearest store was not an option. What do you need to hunt effectively? Not a revolver. A revolver is a short-range weapon, accurate to perhaps 25 yards in skilled hands, less in the hands of average users. It fires a pistol cartridge, which is adequate for stopping a man at close range, but marginal for cleanly killing a deer at 50 yards, and essentially useless for elk at any practical hunting distance. What you need for hunting is a long gun, a rifle, something with a barrel length that allows for velocity, with sights designed for aimed fire at distance, firing a cartridge powerful enough to kill cleanly without simply wounding an animal that then runs for half a mile before dying somewhere you cannot find it. The rifle was the working weapon of the frontier, not the revolver. Now, here is a specific fact that puts the economic reality in sharp relief. In 1873, the same year the Colt single-action army was adopted by the military and began its cultural ascent toward legendary status. The retail price of that revolver was approximately $17. For a working miner earning roughly $4 a day in a good location and considerably less in most locations, $17 represented more than 4 days of wages before any expenses were deducted. After food, lodging, clothing, and tools, a working miner might clear enough disposable income to save $17 over the course of several months of careful management. The Winchester Model 1873 rifle, which appeared in the same year, cost between $20 and $25 for a standard configuration. More than a revolver. But for the money, it gave you a weapon that could reliably hit a target at 200 yards, that fired a cartridge powerful enough for most game, and that was mechanically robust enough to function in the dust and cold and rough handling that frontier conditions imposed on everything. For a man making practical decisions about how to spend limited money on tools that needed to work and keep working, the rifle was the more rational purchase, not the revolver. And yet, the revolver is what the mythology chose. Why? We will get to that. But first, let us look at the weapons that the frontier actually ran on in the specific detail that the documentary record provides. The rifle, most associated with the frontier in terms of sheer numbers and documented distribution, is not any of the famous names that the mythology has preserved. It is a series of practical, relatively inexpensive long guns that were available through mail order, through general stores, and through the trading posts that supplied remote settlements. Weapons made by manufacturers whose names are not romantic. Weapons bought for the same reason a farmer buys a good shovel, because the work requires them and they need to hold up. The Springfield trapdoor rifle, the military surplus weapon that flooded the civilian market after the Civil War as the Army updated its inventory, was everywhere on the frontier during the 1870s and 80s. Available for between $7 and $12 depending on condition, it was affordable for working men in a way that the Colt revolver was not. It was not glamorous, it was not fast. It was a single-shot weapon that required reloading after each discharge, but it was accurate, reliable, and chambered in a cartridge with enough power to handle most situations a frontier man was likely to encounter. Thousands of these rifles moved west through the civilian surplus market in the years following the Civil War. They were in mining camps and on homesteads, and in the hands of hunters and in the corners of barns across the entire frontier landscape. They appear in estate inventories, in newspaper accounts, in letters and diaries, with a frequency that no revolver matches in the documentary record. The shotgun deserves its own moment here. because the shotgun was perhaps the single most practical weapon for the specific conditions of frontier life, and the mythology has almost completely overlooked it. Consider what a shotgun actually does. It fires multiple projectiles in a spreading pattern, which means that a shooter does not need to be a marksman to connect with a target. At the ranges where most violent frontier confrontations actually occurred, inside buildings, across a saloon, in the narrow space of a street or doorway, a shotgun was devastating in a way that a pistol, which required aimed fire, was not. It required less skill to use effectively than a revolver. It was available in configurations that were cheaper to manufacture and therefore cheaper to buy. And the ammunition, loose shot and powder, before the era of fixed shotgun shells, was among the least expensive of any firearm to feed. Frontier saloon owners kept shotguns. Frontier stagecoach guards rode with shotguns. Frontier merchants who needed to protect their establishments kept shotguns behind counters. The practical people who thought seriously about self-defense in the context where self-defense was actually likely chose shotguns at a rate that the mythology has completely erased from the picture. When the mythology shows us the stagecoach, it sometimes includes a guard with a long gun, but it always includes a driver and passengers with revolvers as the primary image of armed frontier travel. The reality was that the guard's shotgun was the weapon that mattered most in a hold-up scenario, and everyone involved in frontier transportation knew it. Here is something that should interrupt the picture entirely. The frontier period overlaps with one of the most significant transitions in the history of firearms, the shift from black powder to modern fixed ammunition cartridges. From muzzle-loading weapons that required a shooter to pour powder, seat a ball or bullet, and prime a firing mechanism for each shot, to the breech-loading and lever-action weapons that used self-contained cartridges and could be fired and reloaded in seconds. That transition happened gradually across the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. And it matters for understanding what people actually carried, because different regions and different economic levels of the frontier population were at very different points in that transition at any given moment. A well-supplied cavalry unit in 1874 might be carrying modern breech-loading rifles and the latest revolvers. A homesteader who had arrived in Kansas in 1862 and had spent everything he had on seed and a plow might still be using a percussion cap rifle that was already technologically outdated when he bought it, because it was what he could afford and it still worked. The frontier was not a uniform technological environment. It was a landscape of radical economic inequality in terms of equipment, where the most modern and expensive weapons existed alongside tools that were a generation out of date in the hands of people at different points on the economic spectrum. This matters because the mythology presents a frontier where everyone is equivalently armed, where the gun on every hip is essentially the same gun, giving everyone in the scene the same potential. That equality of armament is central to the drama. The confrontation is interesting because both parties are equally equipped. The reality was that a mine owner's hired security man and the miner he was hired to intimidate were probably not carrying equivalent weapons. The former was more likely to have a current, functional revolver. The latter was more likely to have a rifle or a shotgun, or an older weapon in some state of repair that ranged from excellent to questionable. Now let us talk about something that the mythology has rendered almost invisible. The knife. Bladed weapons. Knives, in various configurations from small folding pocket knives to the large fixed-blade hunting knives that are specifically associated with the frontier period, were carried by virtually everyone and used constantly for purposes that had nothing to do with violence. Cutting rope, preparing food, working leather, cleaning game, trimming wood, the endless practical tasks of frontier life that required a sharp edge. A man who owned no gun at all owned a knife. It was as fundamental a tool as boots or a hat. And in violent confrontations, knives were used frequently. More frequently in the documented record of frontier violence than the mythology would suggest. Many of the deaths in frontier towns that are classified under violence in historical records were the result of stabbings in saloon fights rather than gunshot wounds. The knife was available, it was always on the person who carried it, and at the ranges where drunken arguments turned physical, it was at least as dangerous as a pistol in the hands of someone who did not practice regularly with firearms. The mythology does not find this romantic. There is no drama in a knife fight that matches the drama of a quick draw. The knife does not have the theatrical value of the revolver. So the knife disappears from the picture, and the gun takes its place as the universal instrument of frontier violence, when the actual record suggests a considerably more mixed and considerably less glamorous reality. Here is another question worth holding for a moment. We have established that rifles and shotguns were more practical, often more affordable, and more widely distributed than revolvers. We have established that knives were ubiquitous. So where did the image of the hip-carried revolver as the defining weapon of the frontier actually come from? The answer involves several things happening simultaneously, and none of them are primarily about what was most practical or most common. The first is military culture. The revolver was genuinely the standard sidearm of the Union and Confederate armies during the Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of men carried revolvers as military equipment for 4 years. When those men came home, some of them kept their weapons. The surplus military revolver market was substantial in the years immediately following the war. For veterans who had carried a handgun for years, the familiarity and comfort of the weapon was real. But veterans were a specific population with a specific history with the weapon. They were not representative of the broad frontier demographic, which included immigrants who had never served, women managing homesteads, former enslaved people building new lives, and men from every background imaginable who arrived without military experience and without any particular connection to revolver culture. The second factor is commercial. Gun manufacturers had a product to sell, and they understood marketing in the specific way that any industry understands it when the survival of the business depends on convincing people to want what you are making. The Colt Company and the Winchester Company and the other major manufacturers of the era were active in promoting their products through channels available to them. The dime novel was one of those channels, not in the direct sense of paid advertising, but in the sense that the stories those novels told created demand for the weapons they featured. A young man reading a story in which the hero's Colt revolver was the instrument of justice and survival was a young man who associated that specific weapon with the qualities he wanted to possess. The gun acquired meaning through the story. The story created a market. That process was not accidental. The mythology of the frontier and the commercial interests of the firearms industry moved in the same direction and reinforced each other in ways that produced the image we have inherited. The third factor is the specific social visibility of the men who did carry revolvers prominently. Revolvers were carried visibly, on the hip, in a holster, by a specific category of frontier men: professional gamblers, hired guns, town marshals and deputies. Men whose social function involved the constant implicit threat of violence, and who needed that threat to be visible to be effective. These men were a small minority of the frontier population, but they were the most socially visible minority, present in the saloons and the commercial districts where people congregated, positioned in the center of the social spaces that travelers and journalists and writers encountered when they visited the West. The gambler, with his revolver and his frock coat, was a figure that a visitor from the East noticed and remembered. The homesteader, 40 miles out, with his worn rifle hanging beside the door, was not a figure anyone was writing stories about. Visibility shaped the myth. The men who wore revolvers visibly in public places became the representatives of the frontier in the stories that Eastern writers took home with them. The far larger population of frontier people who owned rifles and shotguns and used them for the practical purposes of subsistence and protection became background. Now, let us look at some numbers that put the actual distribution of weapons in sharper focus. Probate records, which are among the most reliable sources for understanding what ordinary frontier people actually owned because they list the possessions of deceased individuals for purposes of estate settlement, tell a story that is almost completely at odds with the mythology. A study of probate records from frontier Kansas counties in the 1870s and 80s found that roughly 1 in 4 estates that included any firearm included a handgun. 3 in 4 of the estates with firearms showed rifles, shotguns, or both, with no handgun present. In the same records, the presence of a knife of some kind was nearly universal, appearing in roughly 9 out of 10 estates, regardless of whether firearms were present. 1 in 4, not 4 in 4, not the universal hip-carried revolver of every frontier individual that the mythology implies. 1 in 4 households where firearms were documented at all included a handgun, and that figure almost certainly includes households where the handgun was present but rarely or never carried. This is Kansas in the 1870s and 80s, the heart of the cattle country that produced the legendary cow towns. The landscape most associated in the mythology with the armed frontier. The rifle was the dominant weapon in the records, in the economics, in the practical reality of what frontier life required. Now here is a question for you, and we want you to think about it honestly. When you picture a frontier cowboy riding the range on a cattle drive, what weapon do you see him carrying? Almost certainly a revolver on his hip. Maybe 2 of them. That is the image. That is what every film and every painting has given us. Here is what the actual historical record of cattle drive equipment shows. Most trail hands carried a rifle in a scabbard attached to their saddle. Some carried a revolver as a secondary weapon. Many carried neither revolver nor rifle, and relied on their knife for practical purposes and on the collective deterrence of a group of armed men for anything more serious. The revolver was a luxury item for a working cowboy. His wages on a typical drive in the 1870s ran between $25 and $40 a month, from which he was expected to supply his own basic equipment. A $17 revolver represented nearly half a month's wages before expenses. Many trail hands made the rational decision that the money was better spent on other things. The cattle drive also imposed specific weapon requirements that the revolver did not meet well. Moving a herd of longhorn cattle over 1,000 miles of open country required managing animals, not men. Firing a weapon to turn a stampede, to direct movement, to signal to other hands at distance, those purposes were better served by a rifle or by nothing at all. The close-range personal confrontation for which a revolver was designed was not a regular feature of the working cowboy's daily experience. Let us talk about one more weapon that the mythology has treated with a selective memory: the repeating rifle. The Winchester lever-action rifle, particularly the models of 1866 and 1873, was a genuinely revolutionary weapon in terms of its effect on the balance of practical firepower in the frontier environment. A lever-action rifle could be fired and reloaded quickly, putting multiple rounds on a target in a time that the previous generation of weapons could not approach. These weapons were real, they were present, and they mattered. They mattered in conflicts with native peoples, where a group of settlers or soldiers with repeating rifles had a decisive advantage over opponents armed with older weapons. They mattered in range wars and labor disputes, where a party with repeating rifles could suppress opposition from a party without them. But they were not cheap, and they were not universal. The Winchester 1873 cost between $20 and $25 in a basic configuration, more in fancier versions. That price limited their distribution in the same way that the Colt's price limited the distribution of revolvers among working-class frontier people. What the repeating rifle demonstrates is the way that firepower on the frontier was distributed along economic lines. The people with money had better weapons. The people without money used what they could afford. The mythology presents the frontier as a landscape of individual equality enforced by the universal availability of weapons. The economic record presents something more familiar: a landscape where better equipment went to those who could pay for it, and where the gap between the well-equipped and the poorly equipped had real consequences. Here is something that wraps several threads together and should reset your picture of the frontier weapon landscape almost completely. The most lethal weapon on the frontier, in terms of actual documented deaths and serious injuries over the full period, was not the revolver. It was not the rifle. It was not the shotgun. It was the accident. Firearms accidents killed and maimed frontier people at rates that dwarf the documented violence between men. Weapons stored improperly, cleaned carelessly, handled by children who had learned to load them because the household required it for protection, discharged in the cramped and crowded conditions of small frontier dwellings. Guns that misfired because the powder was damp, or the mechanism was worn, or the man handling them was tired or cold, or simply not paying attention. The frontier's relationship with firearms was not the careful, practiced, disciplined relationship of the mythology. It was the relationship of a working population that needed these tools and used them constantly in conditions that were not ideal by people with varying levels of skill and varying degrees of care, in structures with thin walls and no safe storage, and children underfoot. The cool competence of the Hollywood gunfighter, the man who handles his weapon with the automatic precision of long practice and nerves that never fail him, represents one end of a spectrum. The other end was far more common and far less glamorous. The man who had owned his rifle for 15 years but cleaned it maybe twice. The woman who had learned to load her husband's shotgun because she needed to and who handled it with determination if not skill. The young man whose first experience drawing a revolver quickly ended with an injury to himself. That population, the ordinary, imperfectly skilled, practically motivated people who owned weapons as tools rather than as symbols, was the real armed frontier. Now here is the final question for today, and it is one worth sitting with after this is finished. Why does it matter that we have been given the wrong weapon? Why does it matter that the revolver replaced the rifle in the mythology that the quick draw replaced subsistence hunting as the primary purpose, that the individual confrontation replaced the practical daily use of firearms as the defining image of the armed frontier. It matters because weapons carry meaning in the stories they appear in. The revolver on the hip is a specific kind of symbol. It is personal. It is carried on the body. It is immediately available for use against other people. It implies a world organized around individual confrontations between men where personal courage and personal skill determine outcomes. The rifle, leaning against the wall of a cabin or carried in a saddle scabbard for the purpose of hunting, implies a different world, a world where the primary relationship between a person and their weapon is a relationship with the landscape and with the practical demands of survival, a world where the weapon is a tool for feeding yourself and your family before it is an instrument of confrontation with other people. Those are two very different visions of what the frontier was. The mythology chose the revolver because the revolver told the story the mythology wanted to tell, the story of individual power, the story of personal courage determining outcomes, the story that made the frontier a landscape of dramatic human conflict rather than a landscape of grinding practical survival. The reality had both. There was human conflict, and there were weapons used in it. There was also the long winter, the hungry family, the deer that needed to be found and killed and brought home, and the worn rifle that made all of that possible. That story is less dramatic. It is also more honest, and it tells us more about what those lives actually were than any quick draw ever could. This is Mystery Wild West, the real history of the frontier, told as it was. Leave a comment telling us what surprised you most today. We read every single one, and stay with us because there is more of this waiting.